Stand before Mount Stewart on the shores of Strangford Lough and your breath catches not at beauty alone but at the weight of all those glittering windows conceal, at the terrible price paid by those who built empires on paper and ink, at the stories buried deep in library shelves where false book spines hide more than decorative gaps, they hide the fractures in a dynasty that nearly tore itself apart from the inside, because what really destroyed powerful families wasn't revolution or war or scandal in the tabloid sense but the secrets they kept, the letters they wrote, the compromises they made in the shadows, and the pages they should have burned but didn't, and now, decades after the last Londonderry walked these halls as masters, archivists and historians are finally unlocking the truth, pulling back velvet curtains on rooms that reek of power and paranoia, unearthing documents that reveal how this wasn't just a house but a fortress, not just a library but a vault, not just a family but a political machine that nearly destroyed itself when the very papers meant to preserve their legacy became the instruments of their potential ruin. So what really happened here? What secrets did these walls absorb during a century when Ireland bled and Britain trembled? What compromises were made in oak-panelled studies while servants who knew too much scrubbed floors below? What letters exchanged between this estate and the corridors of Westminster, the palaces of Berlin, the back rooms where empires were dismantled and new orders born, could have, and very nearly did, bring down one of the most powerful political dynasties in British and Irish history, and why, even now, do certain documents remain classified, certain archives restricted, certain truths still too dangerous to speak aloud, because Mount Stewart isn't just another grand house with beautiful gardens and fine furniture. It's a crime scene of sorts, a place where history was made and unmade, where power exercised itself without accountability, where decisions that shaped nations were reached over port and cigars by men who believed themselves entitled to rule, and the evidence of all this, the documentary proof of how power really worked behind the democratic facade, sits in boxes and folders and leather-bound volumes, some now available to scholars, some still locked away, some perhaps destroyed in moments of panic when someone realized that certain truths were simply too dangerous to preserve, and the story of Mount Stewart is ultimately the story of how the powerful tried to control their own narrative, tried to curate their legacy, tried to ensure that history would remember them as they wished to be remembered rather than as they actually were, and how that effort, despite all their resources and influence, ultimately failed, because archives are unruly things, documents multiply beyond anyone's control, servants remember what they weren't supposed to notice, and truth, however buried, however delayed, eventually finds its way into the light. The story begins not with Mount Stewart itself but with its progenitor, with Robert Stewart, 2nd Marquess of Londonderry, better known to history by his earlier title, Viscount Castlereagh, a name that still provokes visceral reactions nearly 2 centuries after his death, a man whose very mention in certain parts of Ireland can still generate bitter words and ancient hatreds, who helped defeat Napoleon and redraw the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna, who suppressed Irish rebellion with an iron fist and pushed through the Act of Union that bound Ireland to Britain against the wishes of millions, who crushed the United Irishmen's uprising in 1798 with mass arrests and military tribunals and executions that left deep scars in Irish memory, who was celebrated as a diplomatic genius by British establishment figures and reviled as a traitor and butcher by Irish nationalists and English radicals alike, whose very funeral procession through London in 1822 was jeered by crowds, shouting insults at his coffin, spitting at the hearse that carried his remains, cheering at his death as though it were a victory, upon whom Lord Byron heaped some of the most savage poetic contempt ever penned, calling him an intellectual eunuch and writing with savage glee, so he has cut his throat at last. He. Who? The man who cut his country's long ago, because Castlereagh didn't die peacefully in his bed surrounded by weeping family, he died by his own hand, found by his physician with a small penknife buried in his carotid artery, blood pooling on the floor of his dressing room at his country estate in Kent, his mind shattered after days of paranoid delusions, crying to his doctor, "Bankhead, let me fall upon your sword," convinced he was being hunted, pursued, blackmailed, watched by enemies closing in from every shadow, believing conspiracies were forming against him, that his ruin was imminent, that exposure of some terrible secret would destroy everything he'd built, and the official story spoke vaguely of overwork and mental strain, of the burdens of high office crushing a brilliant but exhausted mind, Of the terrible toll that years of diplomatic negotiation and parliamentary battles had exacted on his constitution, of a man who'd worked himself literally to death in service of his country, but the whispers told a darker tale, one that wouldn't fully emerge until historians began piecing together fragments decades later, a story of entrapment and extortion, of a man lured to what he thought was an assignation with a woman in a London brothel only to discover he'd been tricked into a room with a young man dressed in woman's clothing, a setup designed for blackmail by enemies who understood that in 1822, in an England where sodomy was still technically a capital crime, punishable by hanging though rarely enforced, where reputation was everything and scandal meant total ruin, where a man's standing in society could be destroyed by mere accusation regardless of proof, the threat of exposure could be more devastating than actual prosecution. And whether Castlereagh was genuinely homosexual and had been caught in a moment of indiscretion or whether he was entirely heterosexual and had been deliberately entrapped in an elaborate scheme to compromise and control him remains disputed even now, historians arguing passionately on both sides, some pointing to the lack of any other evidence of homosexual inclinations in his life, others noting that such evidence would naturally have been suppressed by a family desperate to protect his reputation, but what's certain, what the documentary evidence makes clear, is that he believed himself ruined, that the threat of exposure, whether of genuine transgression or manufactured scandal, drove him to madness, that he spent his final days in mounting terror, barely sleeping, refusing food, speaking of conspiracies and plots and enemies who would destroy him, seeing persecution in every shadow, convinced that forces beyond his control were moving against him, and that he took this secret, along with God knows how many others accumulated during his years at the apex of British power, during the Congress of Vienna where he'd negotiated with Metternich and Talleyrand and Alexander of Russia, during the suppression of the Irish Rebellion where he'd ordered mass arrests and authorized military tribunals that resulted in hangings and transportations, during cabinet meetings where the fate of millions was decided with votes around a table, to his grave, but not before leaving behind papers, correspondence, private diaries, diplomatic memoranda, personal letters to his wife that hinted at burdens he couldn't share, archives that would be gathered and preserved at Mount Stewart by his grieving family, who desperately wanted to rehabilitate his reputation, to show the world that he'd been a great man unfairly maligned, creating the nucleus of a collection that would grow more dangerous, more explosive, more politically volatile with each passing decade, each successive generation adding their own compromises, their own secrets, their own potentially ruinous documents to shelves that groaned under the weight of accumulated dynastic guilt, creating an archive that was simultaneously monument and minefield, tribute and trap. Mount Stewart itself, the neoclassical mansion rising on the Ards Peninsula with its pale stone facade overlooking the dark waters of Strangford Lough, was substantially rebuilt and expanded in the 1820s and 1830s by Castlereagh's half-brother and successor Charles Stewart, the third Marquess, another military man who'd fought in the Peninsular War alongside Wellington and at Waterloo where he'd commanded cavalry, another politician serving in various government posts including ambassador to Vienna, equally entangled in the great dramas of the age, a man who inherited not just an estate and a title but the burden of his brother's destroyed reputation, the weight of public hatred that had followed Castlereagh to his grave and threatened to taint the entire family, and Charles spent years, decades really, trying to rehabilitate his brother's image, commissioning authorized biographies from sympathetic writers, editing and publishing 12 volumes of Castlereagh's correspondence and diplomatic papers, carefully selecting what would enhance the reputation and quietly suppressing what might damage it further, deciding what the public should know and what should remain hidden, exercising the kind of narrative control that only great wealth and social position made possible, but even a careful editor can't destroy everything, even a protective brother leaves evidence of what he chose to conceal, marginalia noting papers removed, references in surviving letters to documents that no longer exist, gaps in correspondence that suggest deliberate deletion, and so the archives grew, containing both the sanitized public version presented in those published volumes and traces of the unsanitized truth in what remained unpublished, in annotations and deletions and suppressions that themselves tell a story, and as the generations succeeded one another, fourth Marquess who died relatively young, fifth Marquess who lived through the Victorian age, sixth Marquess who would face the Irish Crisis, the house accumulated not just furniture and paintings and silver plate but something more volatile, more dangerous, political papers documenting decades of high-level decision-making, private correspondence revealing the gap between public positions and private beliefs. Government documents that probably should have been returned to official archives but somehow ended up in private hands because the boundaries between public office and private privilege were porous. Memoranda recording conversations that were meant to be deniable, letters discussing strategies that would have been scandalous if revealed, diaries confessing doubts and fears and prejudices that contradicted carefully cultivated public images, because these weren't just aristocrats living lives of idle luxury, attending balls and managing estates, they were active players in the machinery of power, serving in cabinets where decisions of war and peace were made, commanding armies in the field, negotiating treaties that redrew borders and determined the fate of nations, suppressing rebellions and managing empires, making decisions that affected millions of lives across the globe, and they kept records. They were compulsive documenters of their own importance, maintaining detailed correspondence with other powerful figures, writing memoirs and diaries, saving drafts of important speeches and memoranda, preserving everything that testified to their central role in great events, and their library. That library, that magnificent room with its thousands of volumes leather-bound in matching sets, with its false book spines commissioned around 1805, those witty fake titles like The Art of Political Lying, and The Biter Bitten, and most tellingly, The Library Whereof the Librarian is Deceit, that scholars only recently recognized weren't just jokes but coded commentary, subtle double meanings reflecting the political and intellectual currents of their time, warnings embedded in whimsy that this library, this collection, would always be as much about concealment as revelation, that knowing what to hide was as important as knowing what to preserve, a tradition of calculated opacity that would continue for generations, became a repository for the kind of material that makes governments nervous and historians salivate, documents that could rewrite official narratives, that could expose the gap between what powerful people claimed publicly and what they actually believed privately, that could reveal the mechanisms by which elite networks maintained power even as formal democracy expanded and the franchise broadened, showing how real decisions were made not in parliament but in drawing rooms, not through votes but through personal connections, not by democratic process but by aristocratic consensus. And by the time the 20th century arrived, by the time the modern age of newspapers and photography and public opinion and investigative journalism had transformed the nature of political life, Mount Stewart housed one of the most potentially explosive private archives in the British Isles, spanning rebellion and union, war and peace, the rise and fall of empire, Irish independence and partition, all filtered through the perspective of a family that was always at the center of the storm, always involved in the great events, always playing for the highest stakes, always generating documents that future generations might desperately wish had never been written. Enter the 6th Marquess, Charles Stewart Vane Tempest Stewart, and his time is the era of Irish Home Rule, that bitter decades-long struggle that would define Anglo-Irish relations and eventually lead to partition, to the creation of Northern Ireland as a separate entity, to the effective sundering of the island in a division whose consequences we're still living with more than a century later, whose wounds still haven't healed, whose violence still erupts periodically, and the 6th Marquess wasn't an observer, wasn't a neutral commentator watching from the sidelines writing thoughtful essays about the Irish question. He was a leader, one of the most prominent and implacable opponents of Home Rule, instrumental in organizing Ulster Unionist resistance to what they saw as Dublin Rule, a key figure in the events leading to the Ulster Covenant of 1912 when nearly 500,000 people signed their names in opposition to Home Rule, some allegedly in their own blood to emphasize the seriousness of their commitment. A moment of such sectarian intensity that it brought Britain and Ireland to the brink of civil war, that saw the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force preparing for armed resistance, that involved gun-running from Germany, that contemplated nothing less than armed rebellion against the lawful government of the United Kingdom if Home Rule were imposed, and Mount Stewart became more than a home. It became a command center, a headquarters where strategy was planned and alliances forged, where documents were drafted and telegrams dispatched, where meetings were held with other Unionist leaders like Edward Carson and James Craig, where the political fate of Ireland was quite literally being decided in private meetings held in oak-panelled rooms while servants moved silently through corridors, emptying chamber pots and carrying tea trays, laying fires and serving meals, seeing everything, hearing everything, understanding perhaps more than their masters realized, because the 6th Marquess and his allies weren't just playing politics, weren't just lobbying and making speeches, they were threatening armed resistance, flirting with treason, coordinating with military officers who might refuse government orders if called upon to enforce home rule in Ulster, contemplating the partition of Ireland as preferable to unity under Dublin. And the papers generated during those feverish years, letters discussing contingency plans for armed resistance, memoranda about weapons shipments and military organization, correspondence with conservative leaders in Westminster who were tacitly supporting what amounted to a potential armed rebellion against a democratically elected government and a constitutional Home Rule Bill, private assurances from British officers that they might refuse orders to move against Ulster, discussions of how to manipulate public opinion in Britain to support the Ulster cause, all of it went into the archives. All of it was preserved at Mount Stewart, a ticking bomb of historical evidence that could have destroyed reputations, could have posthumously convicted men of sedition, could have rewritten the official narratives of how Ireland was partitioned and at whose insistence, showing that partition wasn't an unfortunate necessity but a deliberate strategy pursued by those who preferred separation to any degree of Irish unity. And these papers sat in boxes and filing cabinets and desk drawers, waiting for historians who wouldn't gain access for decades, whose revelations would eventually force a reconsideration of how we understand that pivotal moment in British and Irish history. But it's the 7th Marquess, Charles Stewart Henry Vane Tempest Stewart, who married the extraordinary Edith Chaplin in 1899, where the story becomes truly labyrinthine, where the Mount Stewart archive transforms from politically sensitive to potentially explosive, because Charlie and Edith Londonderry weren't just aristocrats playing at politics, attending debates and hosting dinners. They were among the most powerful political operators in Britain between the world wars, genuine power. Brokers who wielded influence that went far beyond their formal positions, and Edith especially was a phenomenon, a woman who understood power better than most men in her orbit, who created in Londonderry House in London a political salon called the Ark, where she gathered the most influential figures of the age, Winston Churchill who would become the greatest wartime Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald the first Labour Prime Minister and a man who by all accounts was deeply and perhaps romantically attached to her despite the vast gulf in their political philosophies and class backgrounds, Conservative and Labour politicians side by side, military leaders and diplomats, writers and intellectuals, all brought together by Edith's charisma and social genius, where members were given whimsical animal nicknames and played at being above the partisan fray while actually conducting very serious political business, where deals were made and alliances formed and information traded, where cabinet appointments might be influenced by a word in the right ear, where policy positions might be shifted by careful argument over brandy, and Edith's correspondence alone, had it ever been fully published, would have rewritten our understanding of interwar British politics, because she wasn't just hosting parties for entertainment, wasn't just providing pleasant social occasions, she was mediating between factions that couldn't be seen talking publicly, carrying messages between leaders who needed deniable contact, influencing appointments through networks of personal connection, operating as a kind of unelected power broker whose influence derived not from votes or office but from social position and personal relationships, from knowing everyone who mattered and being trusted by them all, and she kept letters, mountains of letters, from prime ministers unburdening themselves about political crises, from cabinet ministers seeking her advice or influence, from society figures sharing gossip that was actually intelligence, from military leaders discussing strategic concerns, all tucked away at Mount Stewart where they joined the ever-growing archive of family secrets, each letter a potential bombshell, each collection a powder keg waiting for the right spark. Meanwhile her husband Charlie, the 7th Marquess, was serving as Secretary of State for Air in the 1930s, a critical position as Britain began rearming in the face of the Nazi threat, responsible for building up the Royal Air Force that would have to defend Britain if war came, charged with assessing foreign air capabilities and recommending appropriate British responses, and here the story takes its darkest turn, plunges into moral territory that still makes historians uncomfortable, because Charlie Londonderry became one of the most controversial advocates of appeasement, not just diplomatic engagement or practical temporizing, but what appears in the archives to be genuine sympathy for Hitler's regime, making multiple trips to Germany throughout the mid-1930s, meeting with Hitler himself at Berchtesgaden, dining with Hermann Göring and touring Luftwaffe facilities, corresponding with Nazi leaders in terms that suggested admiration rather than mere diplomatic courtesy, conducting what amounted to amateur diplomacy that horrified his colleagues in government and eventually contributed to his political downfall and Removal from office, and the question that has haunted historians ever since, the question that the Mount Stewart archives both illuminate and complicate, is why, was it genuine ideological sympathy, aristocratic antisemitism that made him view Nazism as a bulwark against Bolshevism, naive belief that accommodation and understanding were possible with reasonable men, fear of another war and desperate hope that conflict could be avoided through personal relationships, or was it something more calculated, an attempt to buy time for British rearmament while appearing to pursue peace, a double game being played while he also worked to build up the RAF's capabilities? And the answer matters profoundly because Charlie kept records, preserved letters from German officials including Ribbentrop and Göring, maintained memoranda of his conversations with Hitler, kept notes of meetings that he probably should have reported through official channels but instead treated as private diplomatic initiatives, and after his dismissal from government in 1935, bitter and feeling betrayed by Baldwin and the cabinet colleagues he thought were friends, he held on to all of it, adding yet more combustible material to the Mount Stewart archives, documents that in different hands or at different moments could have been interpreted as evidence of collaboration, of treasonous contact with a hostile power before war was declared, of political crimes that might have led not just to disgrace but to prosecution, and even now, even with most of these papers available to researchers, the debate continues about whether Londonderry was a naive fool, a closet fascist, a pragmatic diplomat, or some complicated combination of all three, because the documents support multiple interpretations depending on which ones you emphasize and how you contextualize them, which is perhaps the fundamental truth about archives. They don't provide simple answers, they provide evidence that can be marshaled for different arguments. They give us material to think with rather than conclusions to accept, and Mount Stewart's papers on the appeasement era are perhaps the most morally complex in the entire collection, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we judge historical actors, about whether intentions matter more than consequences, about the line between peace-seeking and collaboration, about how aristocratic networks and personal relationships shaped international relations in ways that democratic publics never knew about and certainly never authorized. And while the Londonderrys played their intricate games in the drawing rooms and libraries above, conducting their political intrigues and building their dangerous archive, below stairs an entire parallel world existed, a hidden infrastructure of labor without which the grand performances above would have been impossible, because Mount Stewart in its prime required a massive staff. Housemaids rising at 5 in the morning to light fires before the family woke, kitchen maids scrubbing pots and preparing vegetables for elaborate meals, footmen serving at table in livery and maintaining strict silence, gardeners tending the extraordinary gardens Edith was creating, chauffeurs maintaining automobiles and driving family and guests, grooms caring for horses in the stables, a housekeeper who ruled the female staff with iron discipline, a butler who managed the male servants and the household's public face, laundresses who scrubbed linens in scalding water until their hands were raw, cooks who prepared 7-course dinners that were carried up narrow service stairs by servants who weren't supposed to be seen, who were expected to vanish into alcoves if they encountered family members in corridors, who lived in cramped attic rooms under the eaves, often sharing beds, who worked 17-hour days for wages that were barely subsistence level, who had 1/2 day off per month if they were lucky, who were forbidden to marry or have followers without permission, who could be dismissed without notice or references for infractions real or imagined. And the thing about servants is that they become invisible to the powerful, who speak freely in their presence as if the servants were furniture, who leave letters on desks and documents in wastepaper baskets, who forget that the girl making the bed might be literate and might read what's lying on the nightstand, that the footman pouring wine might be paying attention to the conversation, that the maid emptying chamber pots might have opinions about the people she serves. And when scholars finally gained access to servant records at Mount Stewart in recent decades, wage books and employment registers and the occasional letter or diary that survived, they discovered a hidden history of those who made the house function, whose labor was absolutely essential but whose existence was barely acknowledged by those who benefited from it, and they found something else too, something that speaks to how paranoid the Londonderrys were about their secrets, evidence that some servants were quietly dismissed under mysterious circumstances during sensitive periods, that others were paid substantial sums at termination far beyond normal wages in what looked suspiciously like payments for silence, that the family was acutely aware that their staff knew too much and that loyalty had to be purchased as well as commanded, because in a house full of secrets, Everyone becomes a potential threat, every dismissed servant is someone who might talk. Every letter glimpsed or conversation overheard is a vulnerability, and the archives contain scattered references to concerns about servant discretion, to worries about what staff might say if they left service, to the need to ensure that those who knew the family's private business remained silent about it, creating yet another layer of concealment, another dimension of the control that the powerful tried to exercise over their own narrative. The Second World War brought temporary transformation to Mount Stewart, requisitioned for military use as so many great houses were, with the Royal Air Force using the estate, 231 Squadron operating from nearby in 1940 during the Battle of Britain, military personnel moving through spaces that had been designed for aristocratic leisure, sleeping in bedrooms where Edith had entertained prime ministers, using drawing rooms as operation centers, and there's bitter irony in this shift, in seeing Mount Stewart contribute to the war effort against the very Nazi regime that Charlie had courted so controversially in the 1930s, in the house that had been a center of appeasement now serving as a small part of Britain's defensive infrastructure, and one wonders what conversations must have occurred, what awkwardness must have existed as Charlie and Edith, still living in part of the house, encountered officers who might well have known about Londonderry's pre-war activities and held him in contempt for them. But the war passed and the family returned to full occupancy, and they faced the same crisis that confronted aristocratic families across Britain. After 1945, the old world was dying, the economic foundations of their power were crumbling, death duties and taxation were confiscatory, the servant class that had made their lifestyle possible was disappearing into better-paid factory work and wasn't coming back, the whole system of aristocratic grandeur was becoming unsustainable, and most critically, they had to decide what to do with Mount Stewart itself, with the house and the magnificent gardens that Edith had created with such genius. And with the archives, those decades upon decades of accumulated papers documenting their family's role in some of the most controversial events in British and Irish history, and it was Edith who made the crucial decision, who in the post-war years began the process that would eventually transfer Mount Stewart to the National Trust, who understood that the age of private palaces was ending and that preservation meant public access, that the only way to save what she created was to give it away. But the question of the archives was more complicated, far more fraught, because these weren't just historical curiosities or family memorabilia, they were still potentially dangerous, still contained material that could embarrass the living, implicate the recently dead, reopen wounds that official histories had carefully sutured closed, challenge comfortable narratives about how Britain and Ireland had reached their current arrangement, about who was responsible for partition and the Troubles that were just beginning, about the depth of appeasement sentiment and how close some British leaders had come to accommodation with Hitler. When the National Trust formally took over Mount Stewart in 1977, accepted from Lady Mary Berry, who was the 7th Marquess's daughter, the initial approach was cautious, reverential, perhaps excessively so, focused on preservation of the physical structure and the decorative arts, treating the house as a museum of aristocratic life frozen at its peak, beautiful and fascinating but essentially historical, divorced from contemporary concerns, and the archives, the papers, the library collection, with its thousands of volumes and its boxes of correspondence and documents, were handled gingerly, catalogued slowly, with access strictly controlled, because everyone involved understood that Mount Stewart wasn't just any country house, it was a political house, a house where history had been made and where the evidence of that history-making sat in filing cabinets and document boxes, and its papers touched on matters that were still sensitive. Northern Ireland was in the midst of the Troubles. Bombs were exploding and people were dying, the wounds of partition were still raw and bloody, the role of Ulster Unionist leaders like the 6th Marquess in creating that division was still contested and politically relevant, the 7th Marquess's dalliance with Nazis could still generate headlines and controversy if handled sensationally, and there was a tacit agreement, never formalized but understood by all parties, that some things could wait, that time would render the explosive inert. That perhaps certain papers might simply be allowed to moulder quietly in locked boxes, their secrets dying with those who might have cared, allowing everyone to avoid uncomfortable confrontations with a past that didn't match the stories nations tell themselves about who they are and how they came to be. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried, documents have a way of demanding attention, and starting in the 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, a new generation of historians and archivists, less deferential to aristocratic sensibilities, more committed to transparency and uncomfortable truths, more willing to challenge official narratives, began demanding fuller access to the Mount Stewart papers, citing public interest and historical importance, arguing that documents held by a public institution like the National Trust shouldn't remain locked away to protect reputations of the long dead, and slowly, incrementally, through negotiations and arguments and sometimes through simple persistence, the locks began to open, the boxes began to be unsealed, and what emerged was stunning not just for what it revealed about the Londonderry specifically but for what it illuminated about how power actually functioned in Britain and Ireland across 2 centuries, because these papers showed the gap between public rhetoric and private belief, between official policy and backroom dealing, between the stories nations tell themselves and the messy, compromised, often ugly reality of how decisions are actually made, and scholars discovered letters from Castlereagh that revealed his genuine anguish over Irish policy, his private doubts about the wisdom of the Act of Union even as he publicly defended it, suggesting that he pushed through a policy he suspected might be wrong. Correspondence from the 6th Marquess that showed the Ulster Unionist leadership was far more willing to contemplate violence than they ever publicly admitted, that the threat of armed resistance wasn't bluff but serious preparation, that they were genuinely ready to fight rather than accept home rule, memoranda that proved conservative leaders in Westminster were indeed tacitly encouraging armed resistance to a government policy, were indeed willing to see the country torn apart rather than concede to Irish nationalism. Documents that revealed Charlie Londonderry's contact with Nazi Germany was even more extensive than previously known, including discussions about potential political realignments that veered dangerously close to suggestions of a separate peace, letters showing that his antisemitism was not occasional or superficial but deeply felt and frequently expressed, and the servant records, when finally examined seriously rather than dismissed as mere administrative detritus, revealed another hidden history entirely. One of exploitation certainly but also of complex human relationships, of loyalty and betrayal. Of workers who spent their entire lives in service to a family that barely knew their names, who raised the Londonderry children while their own offspring were sent away to be raised by relatives, who polished silver and scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots while great political dramas unfolded above their heads, and there were stories there too of servant pregnancies hushed up and young women dismissed without references to hide family scandal, of workers injured in service and receiving no compensation, of the brutal class system that underlay all the glittering surfaces, the beautiful rooms and magnificent gardens and political influence all resting on a foundation of exploited labor, of people treated as instruments rather than human beings, and the archivists who uncovered these records faced a choice: do you sanitize the past, presenting Mount Stewart as simply a beautiful house with interesting history, or do you tell the full story, the uncomfortable story, the story that shows how the beauty was built on invisible labor and how political power was wielded without accountability and how the wealthy protected their interests through means that ranged from the barely ethical to the clearly illegal? The decision, to the National Trust's credit, was ultimately to tell the truth, to present Mount Stewart not as a nostalgic fantasy but as a complex, morally tangled site where beauty and power coexisted with exploitation and moral compromise, to acknowledge that the Londonderrys were both genuinely devoted to what they understood as public service and absolutely ruthless in protecting their interests and their class, that they created extraordinary beauty in Edith's gardens while depending on the invisible labor of dozens of poorly paid workers, that they wielded enormous influence for both constructive and deeply troubling ends, that they were neither the heroes of their own self-conception nor the villains of their enemies' imagination but something more complicated, more human, more morally ambiguous, capable of both genuine achievement and terrible judgment, of both principled belief and naked self-interest, and this approach has made Mount Stewart one of the most intellectually interesting heritage sites in Britain and Ireland, a place where you can admire Edith's sublime gardens, marvel at their botanical diversity and artistic composition, while also confronting the darker realities of the system that made such creation possible, where you can appreciate the political significance of the family while also questioning the democratic legitimacy of such concentrated unelected power, where you can read the actual papers, see the actual letters with their revelations and evasions, and draw your own conclusions about what it all meant, about how we should judge these people, about what their legacy means for us now, and this honesty, this willingness to present complexity rather than comfortable simplicity, makes Mount Stewart a model for how heritage sites might handle difficult histories, how we might preserve beauty while acknowledging its costs, how we might honor achievement while also recognizing moral failure, how we might, in short, grow up as societies and face our pasts with mature acknowledgement of their full complexity rather than childish insistence on simple heroes and villains. But even now, even after all the revelations and all the scholarly work and all the boxes unsealed, not everything is available, not every page turned, not every secret revealed, because some documents remain restricted, either because they contain genuinely sensitive material about living people or their immediate descendants, or because they touch on matters that governments still consider classified for reasons of national security or diplomatic sensitivity, or because the Londonderry family, though they no longer own Mount Stewart, still retain some control over certain personal papers, family documents that are their property even if housed in a public institution, and so the story remains incomplete, the archive still guarding some of its secrets, the library with its false book spines and its tradition of calculated concealment still holding back final revelations. And we're left to wonder what's in those remaining boxes, what letters still unread might further complicate our understanding, what final bombshells might yet be waiting for the restrictions to expire or for some future archivist to discover papers that were misfiled or deliberately hidden, tucked between the pages of books or secreted in false bottom drawers or simply catalogued so vaguely that no one knew what they really contained, because if there's one lesson from Mount Stewart's gradual unveiling, from the slow process of revelation that's been unfolding for decades, it's that we never know the full story, that the past keeps surprising us, that archives are inexhaustible in their capacity to generate new interpretations and challenge old certainties, that papers thought lost have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient moments, and that those who believe they've successfully buried their secrets forever are almost always wrong, because documents outlive reputations, truth outlives spin, and history, however delayed, however contested, eventually catches up with everyone, no matter how powerful they were, no matter how carefully they curated their legacy, no matter how many papers they burned or secrets they kept. Consider again those false book spines in the library, commissioned in the early 19th century as decoration for door panels, long thought to be merely amusing trifles showing the wit and learning of their creators, but when scholar Ed Potton examined them closely in 2016 in research commissioned by the National Trust, he realized they were something more, that they weren't just jokes but coded commentary, reflecting real political tensions and intellectual debates and anxieties about deception and authenticity, titles like The Library Whereof the Librarian is Deceit, that seem now almost prophetic, a warning embedded in whimsy that this library, this house, this archive would always be as much about concealment as revelation, that every document revealed would raise questions about what remains hidden, that the process of historical understanding would be perpetually incomplete because those who held power understood the value of controlling their own narratives, of preserving what enhanced their reputation and destroying what threatened it, except that destruction is harder than it seems, that papers survive fires and floods and deliberate purges, that servants keep letters they were supposed to burn, that copies proliferate beyond anyone's control, that secrets metastasize and multiply, that what you tell one confidant they tell another and the circle widens until containment becomes impossible, and so Mount Stewart's library stands as monument to both the effort to control narrative and the inevitable failure of that effort, to human desire to shape how we're remembered and history's refusal to be fully controlled, to the power of archives and the limits of that power, to revelation and concealment eternally in tension. The secret library of Mount Stewart, then, is both literal and metaphorical, literal in the sense that this library did contain dangerous documents, papers that could have and sometimes did destroy reputations and alter historical narratives, that functioned as vault and arsenal and time bomb all at once, metaphorical in the sense that every great house, every family archive, every repository of power's correspondence is a kind of secret library, containing knowledge that threatens official narratives, that complicate simple stories, that reveals the gap between what power claims to be and what it actually does, between public virtue and private vice, between noble rhetoric and sordid reality, and the question of what to do with such archives, how to balance preservation against privacy, historical truth against institutional reputation, public right to know against individual right to dignity, remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, will always generate conflict because There's no perfect answer, only a series of uncomfortable compromises between competing legitimate interests, and Mount Stewart has chosen, imperfectly but genuinely and more honestly than most heritage sites, to err on the side of revelation, to tell the difficult stories, to present its former owners as complex, flawed, powerful people rather than as sanitized historical characters or cardboard heroes. And that choice makes it one of the most important heritage sites in Britain and Ireland, a place where you can grapple with the real moral complexities of political power and aristocratic privilege and historical memory, where beauty doesn't excuse exploitation and achievement doesn't erase moral failure, where we're asked to think rather than simply to admire, to judge rather than simply to appreciate, to recognize that the past was inhabited by people as complicated and contradictory as we are, capable of both creation and destruction, of both genuine service and ruthless self-interest, of both love and prejudice, of both courage and cowardice, and that our inheritance from them is similarly mixed, beautiful gardens and political freedom but also class exploitation and sectarian division, artistic achievement and democratic institutions but also the long shadow of empire and the unhealed wounds of partition, and that confronting this complexity honestly, resisting the temptation to simple narratives of progress or decline, of heroes or villains, is the work of mature societies, of peoples willing to face their pasts without flinching, to claim their heritage without pretending it was all glorious, to preserve what's beautiful while acknowledging what was terrible, to learn from history not propaganda. Stand before Mount Stewart today, walk through its rooms where Castlereagh's ghost still whispers of paranoia and suicide, where the 6th Marquess's ghost still schemes about Ulster's resistance, where Charlie and Edith still conduct their dangerous games with Nazis and prime ministers, where servants still labor invisibly below stairs, and what you're really seeing is a monument to the futility of concealment, to the impossibility of totally controlling historical memory, to the way that even the most powerful families, even those with all the resources to shape their own narratives and by silence and destroy evidence, eventually lose that battle, because they die and their papers remain, because new generations ask different questions with different values, because archives are time bombs that keep detonating long after everyone involved believed the danger had passed, because truth, however buried, however delayed, however unwelcome, eventually finds its way into the light, and Mount Stewart's library, with its false book spines that joke about deceit, with its coded commentary on concealment, with its hidden documents gradually revealed, with its tradition of secrets that couldn't stay secret, stands as both warning and promise, warning to the powerful that their secrets won't stay secret forever, that archives outlive reputations, that control over narrative is always temporary and ultimately illusory, promise to the powerless that history might eventually be told more fully, that the servants might finally be counted alongside the masters, that the compromises and cruelties might be acknowledged alongside the achievements and beauties, that we might, however incompletely, however imperfectly, move toward a more honest reckoning with what power was and is, with what was built and what it cost to build it, with what we've inherited and what we need to acknowledge about that inheritance, and the pages that nearly destroyed this dynasty are still being turned, still revealing new dimensions of the story, still forcing us to reconsider what we thought we knew, and the process will continue long after everyone reading this is dead, because that's what archives do, they outlive us all. They keep speaking when everyone who might have provided context is silent, they make demands on each new generation to interpret them and judge them and decide what they mean, and Mount Stewart, beautiful and terrible, inspiring and troubling, stands on the shores of Strangford Lough as reminder that the past is never really past, that secrets always escape their keepers, that truth however delayed eventually arrives, and that those who would understand power must be willing to follow truth wherever it leads, however uncomfortable the destination, because the alternative is beautiful lies, sanitized history, a past that never existed except in propaganda and nostalgia, and we deserve better, we deserve the full story with all its moral complexity and human fallibility, and Mount Stewart's willingness to tell that story, to open those archives, to reveal those secrets, makes it not just a beautiful house but a crucible for how we understand our shared past and the uncomfortable truths that past contains.